May 21st, 1944. Dawn had barely touched the horizon when First Lieutenant Thomas Crate Mitchell felt the twin Pratt and Whitney engines of his P-47 Thunderbolt rumble to life beneath him. The 23-year-old pilot from Iowa sat in the cockpit at RAF East Wretham, watching ground crews pull the chocks from his wheels as the smell of high-octane fuel mixed with the morning dew. Through the scratched plexiglass canopy, he could see 11 more Thunderbolts from the 359th Fighter Group forming up on the taxiway, their massive radial engines creating a wall of sound that rolled across the English countryside like mechanical thunder. What Mitchell and his squadron mates did not yet know was that they were about to participate in the opening hours of Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo, a coordinated Allied air offensive that would see more than 760 fighters sweep across northern France in a single day. Their mission had a deceptively simple objective: destroy every locomotive they could find. The mathematics of modern warfare had reduced strategic planning to brutal arithmetic. Each locomotive destroyed meant one less train carrying German reinforcements toward the beaches where Allied forces would land in just 15 days. Each rail line cut meant hours of delay for Wehrmacht divisions racing to contain the invasion. Each marshalling yard reduced to rubble meant tons of ammunition and fuel that would never reach the front. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But the men climbing into their cockpits that morning understood a darker calculation. Train strafing had become one of the deadliest missions a fighter pilot could fly. German flak crews had learned to mount 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns directly onto flat cars, turning every train into a mobile fortress bristling with weapons. The odds of surviving a close-range attack on a defended locomotive were measured not in probabilities but in split-second timing and pure luck. Mitchell adjusted his oxygen mask and ran through his pre-flight checks one final time. 8 50-caliber machine guns loaded and charged, 400 rounds per gun, 3,200 rounds total. At the M2 Browning's rate of fire, that gave him roughly 20 seconds of continuous shooting before his guns ran dry, 20 seconds to find targets, 20 seconds to line up perfect shots while flying at 300 miles per hour just above the treetops, 20 seconds before German gunners could track his aircraft and fill the sky with steel. The mission briefing 3 hours earlier had been characteristically blunt. Intelligence officers had spread reconnaissance photos across the briefing room tables, showing rail lines snaking through the French countryside like veins carrying lifeblood to the German army. Major Robert Breck, the squadron commander, had pointed to a rail junction near Chartres with a stubby finger stained by cigarettes and countless hours gripping a control stick. Gentlemen, as of 0600 hours today, we are no longer asking permission to shoot trains. We are being ordered to destroy them. Every locomotive, every rail car, every piece of rolling stock you can hit. The invasion is coming. The Germans know it's coming. And right now, they're trying to move every available division toward the coast. Our job is to make sure those trains never arrive. The briefing room had gone silent. Fighter pilots were accustomed to air-to-air combat, where skill and aircraft performance determined survival. But train strafing was different. It required pilots to fly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire at altitudes where a single hit could be fatal. The liquid-cooled engines of some fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, were vulnerable to even small arms fire. A punctured coolant line meant engine failure, and engine failure at 200 feet meant no time to bail out. Mitchell's P-47, however, was built for punishment. The Thunderbolt's massive 18-cylinder radial engine could absorb damage that would down other aircraft. Pilots had returned to base with cylinders shot away, oil lines severed, and chunks of cowling missing, the big Pratt and Whitney still running rough but running. That durability had made the P-47 the weapon of choice for ground attack missions, where survival often mattered more than speed or maneuverability. The intelligence officer had continued, his voice cutting through the tobacco smoke that filled the room. Rail traffic in France has increased 300% in the past 2 weeks. The Germans are repositioning armour, bringing up infantry reserves, stockpiling ammunition. They're preparing for our invasion. The transportation plan calls for systematic destruction of the French railway network. Bridges, marshalling yards, locomotives, track. If it moves supplies toward the coast, we destroy it. He had paused, letting the weight of the mission sink in. Be advised, flak concentrations have increased significantly. The Germans are mounting anti-aircraft weapons on trains themselves. Expect quad-mounted 20mm cannon on flat cars. Expect them to be waiting. Approach vectors must be carefully planned. Single passes only. Get in, hit your target, get out. Do not make multiple runs on the same train. The second pass is when they kill you. Now, sitting in his cockpit as the May sun climbed higher, Mitchell thought about those words. The second pass is when they kill you. He had seen it happen. 2 weeks earlier, during a warm-up mission before the main offensive began, he had watched Lieutenant William Macmillan pull up too late while making a second strafing run on a locomotive. The explosion from the boiler had engulfed his P-51, turning the fighter into a ball of flame and debris. No parachute, no time. Just there 1 second, gone the next. The tower's radio crackled in Mitchell's headset. Ramrod flight, you are cleared for takeoff. Good hunting. Mitchell released his brakes and felt the Thunderbolts surge forward. 7 tons of aircraft accelerating down the runway, the massive propeller clawing at the air, pulling him into the sky. Within 90 seconds, all 12 fighters were airborne, forming up into 4-ship flights, climbing to cruising altitude for the flight across the English Channel. The date was deliberate. May 21st marked the beginning of the most intensive phase of the transportation plan, coordinated to peak just before D-Day. Allied planners had calculated that German commanders would need at least 2 weeks to move significant reinforcements to Normandy once the invasion began. The goal was to ensure those 2 weeks stretched into 3 or 4, buying time for Allied forces to establish an unbreakable beachhead. But the plan carried enormous risk. For months, there had been heated debate within Allied command about attacking French railways. The trains carried not just German soldiers and weapons, but also French civilians. Bombing marshalling yards meant destroying French infrastructure that would be needed after liberation. Intelligence estimates suggested thousands of French civilians might die in the attacks. The decision to proceed had been made at the highest levels. General Dwight Eisenhower himself had authorized the offensive, accepting the terrible arithmetic of war. The lives saved by disrupting German reinforcements would outnumber the civilians killed in the bombing. It was a calculation that would haunt commanders for the rest of their lives, but it was also a calculation that strategic necessity demanded. As the 12 Thunderbolts crossed the French coast near Le Havre, Mitchell scanned the sky for enemy fighters. German air superiority over France had been systematically destroyed over the previous 6 months. The Luftwaffe still operated, but in diminishing numbers and with increasingly inexperienced pilots. Most daylight missions now encountered little or no air opposition. The real danger came from below, from the thousands of anti-aircraft positions the Germans had scattered across occupied France. The flight descended to 5,000 feet, a compromise altitude that balanced visibility against vulnerability. Too high, and they would miss targets hidden under camouflage netting. Too low, and every German soldier with a rifle could take shots at them. Mitchell watched the French countryside slide beneath his wings, fields divided by hedgerows, small villages clustered around church steeples, and, cutting through it all, the black lines of railway tracks. Ramrod lead. This is Ramrod 3. I have rail traffic at 2 o'clock, approximately 8 miles. Mitchell's head snapped to the right. In the distance, he could see a thin column of smoke rising from a moving train. The radio crackled again, this time the voice of Major Breck. Ramrod flight, we're going down. Set up for strafing runs. Remember your briefing. Single pass, hit the locomotive, get out clean. Let's make this count. The 12 Thunderbolts peeled off in 4-ship elements, diving toward the train that had no idea death was screaming toward it at 350 miles per hour. Mitchell felt his heart rate spike as the altimeter unwound. 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000. The train was growing larger in his windscreen. details becoming visible. A long locomotive at the front, German war locomotive, a Kriegslokomotive, followed by at least 20 freight cars. 2,000 feet, 1,500. Mitchell's fingers tightened on the stick. He could see the locomotive clearly now, steam pouring from its stack, moving at perhaps 30 miles per hour along a straight section of track. No time to think. Training taking over. Eyes on target. Set up the shot. 1,000 feet. 700. 500. His thumb moved to the firing button on his control stick, and then the world exploded into tracer fire and chaos. The German gunners had been waiting. Quad-mounted 20mm cannon mounted on a flat car. Third in line opened fire, sending streams of shells arcing toward the diving Thunderbolts. The tracers looked deceptively slow, glowing orange streaks that seemed to float upward until perspective and speed revealed their true velocity. Every fifth round was a tracer, which meant for every glowing shell Mitchell could see, 4 more invisible bullets filled the space between. Major Breck's P-47 took hits immediately. Mitchell saw flashes along the wing, pieces of metal spinning away, but the Thunderbolt kept flying. Breck's guns opened up first, all 850s roaring simultaneously, the sound lost in the thunder of the engine but the effect visible as the locomotive's boiler erupted in a geyser of steam and shrapnel. Mitchell was 3 seconds behind him, dropping to 200 feet, his entire attention focused on the target now filling his windscreen. The world narrowed to a simple equation: angle of approach, rate of closure, lead calculation. His thumb pressed the firing button. The P-47 shuddered as all 8 machine guns opened fire. The 50 caliber Browning M2 was one of the most effective weapons ever designed, each round capable of penetrating half an inch of steel at 500 yards. Mitchell held the trigger down for a 2-second burst, sending 160 rounds screaming toward the locomotive at 2,800 feet per second. The effect was catastrophic. The heavy slugs punched through the locomotive's boiler in a dozen places. Superheated steam at 250 pounds per square inch erupted from the wounds, engulfing the front of the train in a scalding cloud. The locomotive's wheels locked as the engineer released the pressure in a desperate attempt to prevent a boiler explosion. Mitchell pulled up hard, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, his vision greying at the edges as blood drained from his head. Behind him, the train was already dying. The locomotive was spewing steam and smoke. The flat car with the flak guns was still firing, but wildly now, the gunners unable to track the fast-moving fighters that had attacked and vanished in seconds. But Mitchell's attention was already elsewhere. His eyes had caught something during the pullout, something that made his tactical instincts scream with opportunity. Less than 3 miles to the northwest, parallel to the first train, a second column of smoke rose into the morning sky. Another train, moving in the opposite direction. Ramrod led, Ramrod 2. I have another locomotive, bearing 295, approximately 3 miles. Request permission to engage. There was a moment of silence on the radio. The briefing had been clear: single targets, single passes, get out clean. But Major Breck was a fighter pilot, and fighter pilots understood that opportunities in combat were fleeting. Ramrod 2, permission granted. All flights reform on my lead. We're going shopping. The 12 Thunderbolts banked left, dropping back to attack altitude. Mitchell's fuel gauges showed he had burned through a quarter of his load. His ammunition counters showed he had fired roughly 800 rounds, still plenty for another attack, still enough fuel for the flight home with reserve. The second locomotive came into view. This one was bigger, pulling a longer train, maybe 30 cars. And this time, Mitchell could see what was on the flat cars. Tanks, German armour, secured to rail cars with chains, being transported toward the coast. Exactly the kind of target the transportation plan was designed to eliminate. He also saw the flak cars, at least 3 of them, spaced evenly throughout the train. The Germans had learned. They were protecting their most valuable cargo with concentrated anti-aircraft firepower. This attack would be different, harder, more dangerous. All flights, this is Ramrod lead. Target is confirmed high value. Multiple flak positions. We're going to hit them in sequence. First flight takes the locomotive. Second flight suppresses the flak cars. Third and fourth flights strafe the cargo. Execute on my mark. Mitchell was flying in second flight. His job would be to shoot at the flak crews while other pilots destroyed the locomotive and cargo. It was arguably the most dangerous position in the attack, deliberately drawing fire to protect the other pilots. He checked his gun sight, checked his airspeed, checked his altitude. Everything had to be perfect because there would be no second chance. Ramrod flight. Execute, execute, execute. The Thunderbolts dove. This time the German gunners were ready. Tracer fire reached toward the attacking fighters before they were even in range. The gunners learning from the first attack, adjusting their timing. Mitchell saw one of the lead P-47 seconds take hits, some smoke trailing from the engine, but the pilot kept his dive, kept his finger on the trigger, sending his own wall of 50 caliber death into the locomotive before pulling up and away, trailing black smoke but still flying. Mitchell's turn. He angled his approach to come in perpendicular to the train, giving him the best angle on the flak car while presenting a harder target for the gunners. The flat car was spewing fire, both 20mm guns hammering away, the entire train wreathed in muzzle flashes and tracer rounds. 200 feet, 150. Close enough to see the faces of the German gunners, close enough to see them tracking his aircraft, close enough to know that if any one of those shells found its mark, he would be dead before his Thunderbolt hit the ground. His thumb mashed the firing button. All 8 guns roared. The flak car vanished in a storm of explosive impacts. The gunners disappeared. The guns fell silent. Mitchell's Thunderbolt flashed over the train at 300 miles per hour, so low that his prop wash rocked the boxcars. And then he was through, pulling up, his heart hammering, adrenaline flooding his system. Behind him, the train was dying. The locomotive was streaming steam. The flak cars were silent. And the cargo cars carrying German tanks were riddled with bullet holes, some already burning from tracer impacts on fuel tanks. Ramrod, flight, form up. We're not done yet. For the next 7 minutes, the 12 Thunderbolts hunted. The sky over northern France became a killing ground for German rail traffic. Every column of smoke became a target. Every locomotive became a mission. Mitchell lost count of his attacks after the 4th train. The pattern became mechanical. Spot the target, dive, fire, pull up, reform, find the next target. His ammunition counters wound down. 3/4 gone, half gone, 700 rounds remaining. Still enough, still hunting. The 5th locomotive died under his guns at 0647 hours. A small switching engine in a marshaling yard, pulling a string of ammunition cars. Mitchell's burst walked up the track, the 50 caliber rounds chewing through steel and steam lines, and the little locomotive shuddered to a stop, bleeding pressure and smoke. The 6th locomotive at 0649 hours. Bigger this time, a heavy freight engine hauling coal cars. The burst hit the boiler dead center. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic. The boiler ruptured under full pressure, turning the locomotive into a bomb that scattered debris across 200 yards of track. Mitchell pulled up through the shrapnel cloud, felt impacts along his wings, but the Thunderbolt kept flying. The 7th at 0651 hours, the 8th at 0653, each one a separate mission. Each one defended by flak guns that were getting better at tracking the low-flying fighters. Each one a risk that could end in sudden violent death. But Mitchell had found something in the chaos of combat, something that every successful fighter pilot eventually discovered. A zone of absolute focus where fear evaporated and training took control. His hands moved on the stick, without conscious thought. His eyes processed information faster than his brain could analyze it. Target. Angle, range, fire, pull, survive. The 9th locomotive died at 0654 hours, the 10th at 0655. Mitchell's ammunition counters were reading critical, less than 400 rounds remaining, enough for maybe 2 more attacks. His fuel gauges were also dropping into the caution range. Time to head home. Time to break off and make for England. But then his wingman called it in. Ramrod 2. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. I have a target-rich environment bearing 5 miles. Multiple locomotives. Looks like a marshalling yard. Mitchell turned his head. In the distance, he could see it. A major rail junction, tracks converging from 4 directions, and sitting on those tracks like prizes waiting to be claimed, at least 5 locomotives with steam up, preparing to move their trains. Ramrod flight, we have one more run. Then we're bingo fuel and headed home. Make it count. The Thunderbolts turned toward the marshalling yard. This would be the final attack of the mission, the last chance to inflict damage before fuel and ammunition forced them back to England. And unlike the previous attacks on moving trains, this target was stationary. The locomotives were sitting ducks. But marshalling yards meant concentrated defences. The Germans knew how valuable these rail hubs were. They would be defended not by a few flak cars, but by permanent anti-aircraft positions. Quad-mounted 20mm guns, 37mm cannon, maybe even the dreaded 88mm guns that could tear a P-47 apart with a single hit. Mitchell checked his ammunition one final time. 380 rounds. Enough for one sustained burst, one final attack. Then his guns would be empty, and he would be defenseless. Major Breck's voice crackled over the radio, calm and professional despite the chaos they had just flown through. All flights, the marshalling yard is too heavily defended for a standard attack. We're going to do this different. We're going in at maximum speed. Single pass. Line astern. First man hits the first locomotive. Second man hits the second. And so on down the line. Do not deviate from your target. Do not make a second pass. Hit and run. Acknowledge. One by one, the pilots acknowledged. Mitchell was third in the attack sequence. His target would be the third locomotive in the yard. The 12 P-47 seconds dropped to wave-top height, accelerating to maximum speed. At this altitude, the big fighters could exceed 400 miles per hour. Speed became armor. Speed became survival. The faster they flew, the harder they were to hit. The marshalling yard rose on the horizon. Mitchell could see the locomotives now, see the defended positions surrounding them, see the guns tracking toward them. And then time seemed to stretch, each second expanding into infinity. Major Breck's P-47 opened fire first, a 2-second burst that walked across the lead locomotive, punching through the boiler, releasing a massive cloud of steam. 1 second later, the second Thunderbolt fired, destroying the second locomotive. Mitchell's turn. His windscreen filled with his target. His thumb pressed the button. His remaining ammunition, all 380 rounds, poured out in a single sustained 3-second burst. The third locomotive exploded under the impact, boiler rupturing, steam and shrapnel erupting upward. Mitchell pulled up through the debris cloud, feeling impacts on his fuselage, hearing the sound of metal on metal as pieces of the destroyed locomotive struck his aircraft. Behind him, the remaining Thunderbolts continued the attack. The fourth locomotive, the fifth, the sixth, each one dying in seconds as the American fighters ripped through the marshalling yard at 400 miles per hour, untouchable, unstoppable, leaving destruction in their wake. And then they were through. 12 Thunderbolts, climbing back to altitude, turning for England. Behind them, the marshalling yard burned. Locomotives lay wrecked. Rail lines were blocked. The German railway network had just suffered a devastating blow. Mitchell safed his guns. The counters read 0, completely empty. He had fired every round, destroyed or damaged multiple locomotives, and survived. His hands were shaking slightly on the stick, the adrenaline starting to fade, the reality of what he had just done settling in. The radio crackled. Ramrod flight, confirm status. One by one, the pilots checked in. 11 voices. 1 missing. Ramrod 6 is down. I saw his aircraft take hits over the marshalling yard. He went into the trees. No parachute. 23 years old, a kid from Michigan, gone. Not even a name on the radio, just a call sign. Just another casualty in a war that was consuming young men at a rate that defied comprehension. Mitchell looked at his fuel gauges. Still enough to make it home, just barely. The Thunderbolts formed up, climbing to cruise altitude for the flight back across the channel. Below them, France continued to burn. What Mitchell did not know, could not know in the immediate aftermath of combat, was that the mission he had just completed was being replicated across hundreds of miles of French railway. 763 fighters from the Allied Expeditionary Air Force were executing coordinated attacks on rail targets throughout northern France. 500 more fighters from the 8th Air Force were ranging over Germany and Belgium, shooting up trains wherever they found them. In the space of a few hours on May 21, 1944, the Allied air forces had begun the systematic destruction of the German railway network. The opening moves of Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo had inflicted catastrophic damage. Initial reports would later estimate that 475 locomotives had been destroyed or damaged in the first 2 weeks of the operation. Railway lines were cut at 150 different points. Marshalling yards were reduced to rubble, but the price had been paid in blood. The fighters that had survived the mission limped back to England with battle damage, empty guns, and burning fuel tanks. Some didn't make it. They crashed into the Channel, or ran out of fuel over France, or took too much damage to maintain altitude. The pilots who did make it home landed at their bases, knowing they would have to do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until D-Day arrived and the invasion began. Mitchell's Thunderbolt touched down at RAF East Wretham at 0802 hours. The big fighter had taken hits, 47 bullet holes in the wings and fuselage, 1 elevator control partially shot away, hydraulic fluid leaking from damaged lines. But the massive radial engine was still running, still pulling him home, proving once again why pilots trusted the P-47 more than any other aircraft for ground attack missions. He shut down the engine and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, listening to the metal tick as it cooled, smelling the oil and cordite, feeling the exhaustion wash over him. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, counting the bullet holes, examining the damage, already calculating how long it would take to repair. The crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Thompson, climbed up on the wing and looked through the canopy at Mitchell. "How many, Lieutenant? How many locomotives had he hit?" He had lost count somewhere after the 6th, maybe 8, maybe 10, maybe more. The entire mission had become a blur of targets and tracer fire. "I don't know, Sarge. A lot. We tore them up out there." Thompson nodded and patted the side of the Thunderbolt. "She's hurt, but she'll fly again. We'll have her ready by tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning, another mission. More trains, more flak, more chances to die." The thought should have terrified him, but Mitchell felt only a strange detachment, as if his emotions had been burned out by the intensity of combat. He climbed out of the cockpit and stood on the wing, looking back across the Channel toward France. Somewhere over there, German commanders were discovering that their railway system was being systematically destroyed. Trains that should have delivered reinforcements were burning wrecks. Locomotives that should have been moving supplies were shattered steam. The debriefing lasted 2 hours. Intelligence officers crowded around maps spread across tables in the operations room, marking each reported locomotive kill with red grease pencil. Mitchell sat with the other pilots, smoking cigarettes and drinking bitter coffee while they recounted the mission in exhaustive detail. Locomotive at grid reference 472915. Direct hits observed. Steam release confirmed. Target destroyed. Marshalling yard at Chartres. Multiple locomotives engaged. At least 3 confirmed destroyed. 2 probables. Rail junction northwest of Droy. 2 locomotives destroyed. Ammunition cars ignited. Secondary explosions observed. The intelligence officer, a captain named Morrison who had never flown a combat mission in his life, kept pressing for details. Exact locations, exact times, exact damage assessments. Mitchell understood the need for accuracy, but there was something almost obscene about reducing the morning's violence to coordinates on a map. Major Breck stood at the front of the room, his flight suit still showing sweat stains from the mission, and addressed the assembled pilots. "Gentlemen, what you accomplished today was the opening move in the most important air offensive of the war. The transportation plan isn't just about destroying trains, it's about isolating the invasion beaches. When our boys hit those beaches in 2 weeks, every German division that isn't there because we stopped their train is a victory. Every tank that doesn't make it to Normandy because we destroyed the K, a locomotive carrying it, is lives saved." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Today, the 8th Air Force and RAF combined flew over 1,200 sorties against rail targets. Initial estimates suggest we destroyed or damaged more than 200 locomotives in a single day. The Germans are scrambling. They're pulling repair crews from across occupied Europe. They're trying to clear blocked rail lines, and tomorrow we're going to do it again, and the next day, and every day until there's nothing left to shoot." The room was silent. Mitchell looked around at the faces of his fellow pilots. Young men, most of them, boys, really, wearing the responsibilities of warriors. Some looked excited, energized by the success of the mission. Others looked exhausted, drained by the intensity of combat. One pilot, a replacement who had flown his first combat mission that morning, was quietly crying, trying to hide it behind a raised coffee cup. Mitchell understood. The first mission changed you, showed you that war wasn't romantic or glorious, but simply violent and terrifying. The young pilot had made it through alive, which made him luckier than Ramrod 6. But he would carry the memory of that first combat experience for the rest of his life, however long that life might be. The strategic context of Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo extended far beyond the missions flown by individual pilots. At the highest levels of Allied command, the offensive represented a fundamental shift in how air power could be applied to support ground operations. For years, strategic bombing had focused on industrial targets deep in Germany. Factories, oil refineries, ball-bearing plants. The theory held that destroying German industrial capacity would cripple the Nazi war machine. But the transportation plan took a different approach. Instead of attacking production, it attacked distribution. Instead of bombing factories in the Ruhr, it destroyed the railways that moved products from those factories to the front lines. The beauty of this strategy lay in its simplicity. A locomotive took years to build but could be destroyed in seconds. A railway bridge required massive engineering to construct, but could be dropped with a few well-placed bombs. Rail lines were vulnerable, impossible to hide, and essential to German military operations. The Germans had recognized this vulnerability. Throughout early 1944, they had worked frantically to strengthen rail defenses. Anti-aircraft batteries proliferated around marshaling yards. Flak guns were mounted on trains themselves. Fighter aircraft were assigned to protect critical rail junctions. But the sheer scale of the Allied air offensive overwhelmed these defenses. Consider the mathematics. The German railway system in occupied France consisted of thousands of miles of track, hundreds of locomotives, dozens of major marshalling yards. Defending all of it simultaneously was impossible. The Allies, meanwhile, could concentrate overwhelming force against specific targets. When 700 fighters attacked rail targets in a single day, no defensive system could stop them all. The psychological impact on German railway workers was equally significant. French railway employees, many of whom were forced labourers or conscripts, began abandoning their posts. Why risk death to keep trains running for an occupying army? As French workers fled, the Germans brought in their own personnel, but even German railway crews faced a terrible choice: continue working and risk death from Allied strafing attacks, or refuse and face punishment from their own military authorities. This psychological dimension of the offensive has received less attention from historians than the physical destruction, but it may have been equally important. A railway system requires thousands of workers to function: engineers to drive locomotives, signalmen to control switches, maintenance crews to repair track, dispatchers to coordinate schedules. When those workers become too terrified to do their jobs, the system collapses, even if the physical infrastructure remains intact. Mitchell learned these broader strategic implications over the following days as the offensive continued. May 22nd, May 23rd, May 24th. Every day, the same mission: hunt locomotives, destroy rolling stock, cut rail lines. The work became routine, which was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of it all. Killing became a job, measured in missions flown and targets destroyed. His personal tally grew. By May 25th, he had participated in attacks that destroyed or damaged more than 20 locomotives. The exact number was uncertain because confirmation in the chaos of combat was often impossible. Had that locomotive he strafed actually been destroyed, or merely disabled? Had the boiler exploded, or just vented steam? Intelligence officers made their best assessments based on pilot reports and reconnaissance photos, but the numbers were always approximate. What wasn't approximate was the cost. The 359th Fighter Group lost 11 pilots in the first week of Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo. 11 names crossed off the roster, 11 empty bunks in the barracks, 11 sets of personal effects packed up and shipped home to families who would receive Western Union telegrams beginning with the words, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret." The dangers of train strafing became clearer with each mission. The flak was bad enough, but pilots discovered other hazards. Boiler explosions could spray shrapnel hundreds of feet into the air, and aircraft flying through these debris clouds often sustained catastrophic damage. One P-51 pilot flew into a cloud of steam and superheated metal from an exploding locomotive and emerged with his canopy shattered, his face burned by scalding steam, and his engine damaged by debris. He managed to crash land in a French field and was rescued by the resistance, but his flying days were over. The liquid-cooled engines on P-51 Mustangs proved particularly vulnerable. The Merlin engine's cooling system ran through radiators mounted under the fuselage and in the wings. A single bullet through a coolant line meant the engine would overheat and seize within minutes. Many pilots switched from P-51 seconds to P-47 seconds, specifically because the Thunderbolt's radial engine could survive damage that would down a Mustang. But even the rugged P-47 had its limits. On May 27th, Mitchell watched a Thunderbolt from another squadron take a direct hit from a 37mm shell while attacking a train near Rouen. The shell penetrated the engine, detonating inside the firewall. The entire front of the aircraft disintegrated. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. These losses forced tactical adaptations. Pilots began attacking from different angles to avoid predictable approach patterns. Some adopted a technique of dropping their external fuel tanks on stopped trains, then igniting the spilled gasoline with incendiary rounds. The resulting fires would engulf the entire train without requiring the pilot to strafe the locomotive directly, though this tactic was controversial because it was impossible to tell if civilians were aboard. The moral complexity of the mission weighed on some pilots more than others. Mitchell tried not to think about it. His job was to destroy locomotives. Whether those locomotives were carrying German soldiers or French civilians wasn't information available to a fighter pilot diving at 400 miles per hour. The bombs and bullets didn't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. War made no such distinctions. But late at night, lying in his bunk and listening to the sound of bombers taking off for night missions over Germany, Mitchell sometimes wondered about the people on those trains. The engineers who died when boilers exploded, the passengers caught in strafing runs, the French railway workers forced to repair the damage, only to watch their work destroyed in the next attack. These thoughts had no place in a combat briefing, but they existed nonetheless, pushed down deep where they couldn't interfere with the mission, but never entirely forgotten. By early June, the effects of Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo had become undeniable. German railway traffic in France had dropped to 38% of its January levels. The index measuring rail efficiency, which had stood at 69 in mid-May, had collapsed to 38 by June 9th. Critical rail lines were cut, marshalling yards were unusable. Locomotives sat wrecked beside destroyed bridges, their cargo never delivered. More importantly, German commanders found themselves unable to reposition forces effectively. Divisions ordered to move toward the invasion beaches remained stranded hundreds of miles away, waiting for rail transport that never arrived. When the Allies landed at Normandy on June 6, the German response was fragmented and delayed. Units that should have arrived within hours took days. Reinforcements that should have massed for a coordinated counterattack trickled in piecemeal, allowing Allied forces to establish their beachhead. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, later testified that the destruction of the French railway system was a decisive factor in the failure of German defensive operations. His forces simply could not move fast enough to contain the invasion. The transportation plan had worked. Mitchell flew his last Chattanooga mission on June 4, 2 days before D-Day. By that point, rail targets in northern France had become scarce. Most locomotives had been destroyed or withdrawn to safer areas. The trains that still operated ran only at night, and even then sparingly. The offensive had accomplished its objective. His final tally, according to official records, credited him with participation in the destruction of 12 confirmed locomotives, with another 8 listed as probable. These numbers were conservative. Intelligence officers only counted kills that could be verified through multiple sources or reconnaissance photography. Mitchell suspected he had hit many more, but without confirmation, they didn't count. Not that the numbers mattered much to him by that point. He had survived. That was the only statistic that felt significant, survived when so many others hadn't. Survived long enough to see the invasion succeed. Survived to continue flying missions through the summer of 1944 as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and raced across France. The human cost of Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo extended beyond the Allied pilots. German railway casualties were never precisely documented, but estimates suggest thousands of locomotive engineers, railway workers, and train crews died in the attacks. French civilian casualties are even harder to calculate. Some historians estimate that several thousand French civilians died in the bombing and strafing of trains during May and June of 1944. These deaths raise uncomfortable questions about the ethics of the transportation plan. Were they necessary? Could more selective targeting have achieved the same results with fewer civilian casualties? Allied commanders believed they had no choice. The success of the invasion depended on German forces being unable to concentrate at the beaches. Every day of delay for German reinforcements meant more Allied soldiers survived. The arithmetic of war reduced human lives to calculations of military necessity. Post-war interviews with French survivors revealed complex attitudes toward the offensive. Many understood that the attacks were necessary to defeat Germany. Others remained bitter about the destruction of French infrastructure and the deaths of French civilians. The liberation of France required French suffering, a paradox that has never been fully resolved. The tactical lessons learned from train strafing missions influenced ground attack doctrine for decades afterward. The importance of surprise, the necessity of single-pass attacks, the vulnerability of liquid-cooled engines to ground fire, the effectiveness of concentrated machine gun fire against lightly armored targets. These principles, written in the blood of pilots who died learning them, became standard training for future generations of fighter pilots. The P-47 Thunderbolt emerged from the campaign with an enhanced reputation. Its ability to absorb damage and continue flying made it the preferred aircraft for ground attack missions. The type would go on to destroy thousands more locomotives, vehicles, and ground targets throughout the remainder of the war. Thunderbolt pilots claimed to have destroyed 9,000 locomotives by the time Germany surrendered in May 1945. That figure is almost certainly inflated by overclaiming, a persistent problem in combat aviation, where multiple pilots might claim credit for destroying the same target. But even if the actual number was half the claimed total, it represents an astonishing level of destruction. The German railway system, which had been one of the most efficient transportation networks in the world before the war, was reduced to rubble by sustained air attack. Mitchell continued flying combat missions through August 1944, when he was rotated back to the United States for a war bond tour. He had completed 68 combat missions, been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and survived when so many others had not. The War Bond Tour sent him to cities across America, where he gave speeches to war workers about the importance of aircraft production and spoke to high school students about the glamour of flying fighters. He hated every minute of it. There was nothing glamorous about war, nothing romantic about watching your friends die, nothing heroic about the moment when you pulled the trigger and watched human beings disappear in explosions of steam and fire. But the war effort needed heroes, needed symbols, needed young men in dress uniforms to tell sanitized stories that would keep the public motivated. So Mitchell gave the speeches, shook hands with factory workers, signed autographs for teenage boys who saw him as everything they wanted to become, and late at night, alone in hotel rooms across America, he tried to reconcile the person everyone thought he was with the person he knew he had become. The war ended in May 1945. Mitchell was still stateside when Germany surrendered. He was released from active duty in October and returned to Iowa, where he married his high school sweetheart and took a job managing a grain elevator. He flew private planes occasionally but never returned to military aviation. In the decades after the war, Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo faded from public memory. The invasion of Normandy dominated historical narratives. The liberation of Paris, the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine. These were the events that defined the war in Europe for most Americans. The weeks of intensive combat that destroyed the French railway system became a footnote, mentioned briefly in histories of the air war but rarely examined in detail. But military historians recognized its significance. The transportation plan demonstrated that air power could decisively influence ground operations through strategic targeting of enemy logistics. This lesson would be applied in every subsequent American conflict. In Korea, American fighters attacked North Korean railways with the same tactics developed over France in 1944. In Vietnam, the Ho Chi Minh Trail became a target for sustained air interdiction. In the Gulf War, precision weapons destroyed Iraqi transportation networks before ground forces ever crossed the border. The fundamental principle remained constant. Modern armies require massive logistical support. Disrupting that support can be more effective than attacking the army directly. A tank without fuel is just a metal coffin. An infantry division without ammunition can't fight. An air force without parts can't fly. Cut the supply lines, and the military collapses regardless of how many soldiers it has or how advanced its weapons might be. Mitchell understood this in an immediate, visceral way that strategic planners in air-conditioned offices could never fully comprehend. He had seen what happened when a locomotive's boiler exploded, had watched trains carrying German soldiers to the front lines transform into burning wrecks, had participated in the systematic destruction of an entire transportation network. The theories in staff college textbooks were his lived experience. He rarely spoke about the war in later years. His children grew up knowing their father had been a pilot but little more. The medals stayed in a drawer, shown occasionally to grandchildren who asked questions but mostly forgotten. The memories remained sharp, but Mitchell found that talking about them made everything worse, not better. Better to let the past stay buried. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, Mitchell was invited to attend a ceremony in France honoring Allied veterans. He initially declined but was persuaded by his daughter to make the trip. At 83 years old, his flying days were long behind him, but the memories were as vivid as ever. Standing on a rebuilt railway platform near Chartres, looking at trains moving efficiently along tracks that had been destroyed and rebuilt decades earlier, Mitchell felt the weight of time pressing down on him. Somewhere nearby were the sites where he had strafed locomotives in May 1944. The exact locations were lost to memory and modernization, but they were there, invisible markers of violence that had shaped the course of history. A young French woman approached him, a translator from the ceremony. "Excuse me, sir. Were you here during the war?" Mitchell nodded. "I flew missions in this area, May and June of 44. Against the railways?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather was a locomotive engineer. He died in an air attack in May 1944. My grandmother always said it was necessary, that the liberation required sacrifice. but she never forgot him. Mitchell didn't know what to say. What could you say to the granddaughter of a man you might have killed? That you were sorry? That it was war? That you were just following orders? All of those things were true, and all of them were inadequate. "I'm sorry," he finally said. It was insufficient, but it was honest. The woman nodded. "Thank you. And thank you for your service. My grandmother also said that without the Allied pilots, France would still be occupied." She understood. She walked away, and Mitchell stood alone on the platform, watching modern French trains carry passengers and freight along routes where his .50 caliber bullets had once torn apart steel and flesh. The past and present existed simultaneously in that moment, separated by 5 decades, but somehow still connected. The story of Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo is ultimately a story about the arithmetic of war and the cost of victory. The offensive succeeded brilliantly in its tactical and strategic objectives. German rail traffic was devastated. The invasion succeeded. Allied forces liberated France and pushed deep into Germany. The war in Europe ended less than a year after the Normandy landings, saving countless lives that would have been lost in prolonged combat. But that success came at a price measured in destroyed aircraft, killed pilots, dead railway workers, and civilian casualties. The price was paid by young men like Mitchell, who survived with memories they could never fully escape. It was paid by German and French families who lost loved ones in the attacks. It was paid by communities across France that watched their infrastructure destroyed in the process of liberation. Whether that price was worth paying is a question that has no simple answer. From a purely military perspective, the operation was an unqualified success. It achieved its objectives with acceptable losses and contributed directly to Allied victory. From a human perspective, the calculus is more complex. Every death in war is a tragedy, even when that death serves a strategic purpose. The necessity of military action doesn't erase the human cost. Mitchell wrestled with these questions for the rest of his life. In his final years, suffering from the lung cancer that would eventually kill him, he gave a rare interview to a historian researching the transportation plan. His reflections capture the complicated legacy of the operation better than any official after-action report. "We did what we were ordered to do, and we did it well. We destroyed those locomotives, cut those rail lines, stopped those trains, and it worked. The invasion succeeded. We won the war. But winning doesn't make it any easier to remember the faces of German engineers visible in locomotive cabs moments before you opened fire. Doesn't make it any less haunting to think about the French civilians who might have been on those trains. We were the good guys, fighting against genuine evil. The Nazis had to be stopped. But being on the right side doesn't mean everything you do is right. It just means it was necessary." He paused, struggling for breath, the cancer making each word an effort. "I'm proud of what we accomplished, proud that I served, proud that I survived to come home, but I'm also haunted by it. Both things are true. That's what they don't tell you about war. You can be proud and haunted at the same time. The pride doesn't erase the cost, and the cost doesn't diminish the necessity. You just have to live with both." Mitchell died in 1997 at the age of 86. His obituary in the Des Moines Register mentioned his military service in a single paragraph, focusing instead on his 50 years in the grain business and his contributions to his local community. There was no mention of the locomotives he destroyed, the missions he flew, or the small but significant role he played in one of the most important air offensives of World War II. The legacy of Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo extends beyond the individual stories of pilots like Mitchell. It represents a pivotal moment in the evolution of air power doctrine. Before the transportation plan, strategic bombing focused primarily on destroying enemy production capacity. After it succeeded, military planners recognized that attacking distribution networks could be equally or more effective. This shift in thinking influenced how air power would be employed in every subsequent conflict. The principle of interdiction, cutting enemy supply lines through air attack, became a cornerstone of American military doctrine. The tactics developed over France in 1944, the techniques of low-level attack perfected at such high cost, would be refined and applied by future generations of pilots flying jet aircraft with guided weapons far more sophisticated than the simple 50-caliber machine gun. The technologies have changed, but the fundamental strategic concept remains the same. Find the enemy's logistical vulnerabilities, attack them systematically, create disruption faster than the enemy can repair damage, force them to divert resources from combat operations to defensive measures, wear them down through sustained pressure on their supply lines. These principles, written in the experiences of pilots who dove through flak to shoot up trains on French railways, continue to shape military operations in the 21st century. The lessons learned by men like Mitchell at the cost of their friends' lives and their own peace of mind remain relevant decades later. For the civilians who lived through the offensive, the memories are different but equally persistent. Elderly French men and women who were children in 1944 still remember the sound of fighter planes diving to attack, the explosions of boilers rupturing under machine gun fire, the sight of trains burning beside destroyed bridges. These memories exist alongside gratitude for liberation, a complicated mixture of trauma and thankfulness that defies simple categorization. German veterans of the campaign, those who survived to tell their stories, speak of the helplessness of watching Allied fighters destroy their transportation network while the Luftwaffe was unable to provide effective defense. By June 1944, German air superiority over France had been completely shattered. German fighters existed, but in insufficient numbers and with inadequately trained pilots to challenge the overwhelming Allied air forces. This air superiority, achieved through months of grinding attrition against the Luftwaffe, made Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo possible. Without it, sending hundreds of fighters on low-level attack missions would have resulted in catastrophic losses. Air superiority created the conditions where tactical air power could be decisive at the operational and strategic levels. The offensive also demonstrated the importance of coordination between different types of air operations. Strategic bombers attacked marshaling yards and railway bridges. Medium bombers struck rail facilities and repair depots. Fighters strafed locomotives and rolling stock. Reconnaissance aircraft identified targets and assessed damage. This integration of different capabilities, coordinated across multiple air forces with different command structures, was itself a significant achievement. The success of the transportation plan validated the theories of air power advocates who had argued that aviation could be decisive in modern warfare. For years, skeptics had questioned whether aircraft could do more than provide reconnaissance and limited tactical support to ground forces. The systematic destruction of the French railway system proved that properly employed air power could shape the entire strategic environment of a campaign. But this validation came with caveats that are sometimes overlooked in triumphalist narratives. The transportation plan worked in large part because the Allies had achieved overwhelming air superiority before beginning the offensive. It worked because Allied industry could replace aircraft losses faster than German industry could produce new fighters. It worked because Allied training systems produced replacement pilots in numbers the Luftwaffe could no longer match. In other words, the operation succeeded not just because of tactical brilliance or technological superiority, but because of massive advantages in resources, production capacity, and trained personnel. These advantages were the result of years of industrial mobilization and training programs. The pilots who flew the missions in May and June 1944 were the products of the most extensive pilot training system ever created, backed by the largest aviation industry in history. These factors don't diminish the achievement, but they provide context. Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo wasn't just about brave pilots flying dangerous missions. It was about an entire industrial and military system organized to project overwhelming force against a weakening enemy. The individual courage of pilots like Mitchell was essential, but it operated within a larger framework of systematic advantage. This context matters when considering how the lessons of the offensive apply to contemporary conflicts. Modern military planners sometimes focus on the tactical successes, while underestimating the systemic advantages that made those tactics effective. You can't simply copy the tactics without replicating the broader conditions that enabled their success. Nevertheless, certain principles remain universally applicable. The importance of attacking enemy logistics, the value of systematic rather than opportunistic targeting, the necessity of accepting losses to achieve strategic objectives, the requirement for detailed planning and coordination. These lessons transcend the specific historical context of World War II and remain relevant to military operations today. The final assessment of Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo must balance its undeniable effectiveness against its human cost. The operation achieved its objectives and contributed significantly to Allied victory in Europe. It saved countless Allied lives by preventing German forces from concentrating against the invasion beaches. It demonstrated the potential of air power to decisively influence ground operations, but it also killed thousands of people, destroyed infrastructure that took years to rebuild, and left psychological scars on both the pilots who flew the missions and the civilians who survived the attacks. It required young men to perform acts of violence that would haunt them for decades. It placed French civilians in the path of military operations over which they had no control. Both of these assessments are true simultaneously. The operation was necessary and horrific, justified and tragic, successful and costly. These contradictions can't be resolved through historical analysis. They simply exist as part of the complex reality of warfare, where the achievement of noble goals requires terrible means. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.